Hi there and welcome to MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. We're so glad that you're joining us. We have a full table tonight ready to take on this week's headlines. Plus, we have an in-depth interview with Dr. Nikolai Vitti, the Detroit Schools Superintendent. He talks with Stephen Henderson and I about the beginning of the school year, his concerns, and things he's doing to try and make a difference. And we are also following the story of one Detroit woman's deportation. It's a hard look inside the immigration process, and our One Detroit crew heads to Mexico to see what happens when people get sent back to a country after spending the majority of their lives in America. That is all coming up. But we do start with Detroit Schools Superintendent Dr. Vitti. Stephen Henderson and I had a long conversation with him as an hour-long special on education that took place in the Brightmoor neighborhood of Detroit this past week. He answered questions from students and parents, plus was very frank about the organizational challenges he is facing and some of the solutions he plans to put in place. Take a look.
The amount of rebuilding that has to be done because of the lack of proper leadership. It's not
just on the academic side.
It's across the board in just about every aspect of the district.
Yeah. You know, I can imagine when you head to all of these schools and every community meeting that you've been through since school has opened, that everyone's got a little something that they want to tell you or a little something that they want to say. What are some of the biggest concerns on parents' minds as they go back to school with their kids this year so far?
Well, I think we heard some of that tonight. Safety. We can't even talk about academics if children don't feel safe. I hear that often. I hear about the need for programming across all communities and all zip codes. You talk about, I often hear the need for high schools in all communities, especially where we are at right now. Years of mismanagement, not engaging the community authentically has led to deserts in this community in particular. That has been an overwhelming concern. And just a need for arts and music and restoring of that is something I hear consistently. And lastly, to pay employees at a higher level to be more competitive. Those are some of the things I often hear.
All right, and you just listed off a good list of things. So then how do you sit and say, how do I categorize where I'm going to start first and start to tick things down the line and say, hang on, we're getting to that point. How do you categorize all that?
Well, one thing the school board and I have focused on is strategic planning. One thing that you can't move a district to another place if you don't have a clear set of, you don't have a clear vision, mission, core values, priorities, strategies, and metrics that go along with that. And we already went through a board retreat to define those things. We've already engaged the community with over 15 sessions where almost 400 people have been engaged. In fact, this week the board will review the revised strategic plan and put forth to them for a vote. And that will really be our guidepost on where we're headed. We're going to revise our budget for 18-19 to drive that strategic plan. And many of the things that I talked about that were mentioned as needs are already embedded in that strategic plan as a draft.
The other thing I heard in all of those things is the cash register ringing up, lots of costs. All of those things you talk about are going to cost money, and money has been the thing that we've struggled, you know, the most with here in Detroit in terms of schools. Can you open a school in a community like Brightmoor where you don't have one? And if you do, where do you get the money for that?
Well, one thing that we have to recognize is that money needs to drive priorities. We need to be transparent with how we use our dollars. We have to have line item budgets. We have to have revenue clearly articulated and expenditures clearly articulated, driven by that strategic plan, not done randomly, not done by politics, not done by who meets with the superintendent last or who meets with the school board last, but truly focused on children. So revising that budget, we've already started to do that. We'll continue to do that throughout this year to next year to drive priorities. And then after that, we have to know what the gap is as far as what we need to deliver to children. And that's where lobbying in Tallahassee and Lansing is going to be important. I always say Lansing.
Florida again.
I say that often. But you know, the need for a weighted student formula is going to be important. Yeah. We have to get to a point where to educate a child in Birmingham is not the same cost to educate a child in Detroit. Right. And we have to see weighted student formula funding for poverty, for special needs children, for English language learners. Because again, if we're really about equal opportunity, then you have to fund public education appropriately. And then lastly, we have to have accountability with what we spend our money on. And that's been lacking in years previously in Detroit. Specifically for a school in this area, we're going to do a facilities review throughout the entire district, understand the gap between where schools are for facilities and where is the academic standard for 2021. understand the gap throughout the district, recognize residential growth declines, and then start to make some decisions in the next 2 to 3 years on where we build new schools, maybe where we consolidate schools, but to actually have a comprehensive plan so that every community has access to a K-8 and a high school, and students don't have to get on a bus to travel 2 to 3 hours in order to access school.
Yeah. Talk a little about how that weighted formula works where you used to work in Florida. They do it differently than we do here in Michigan, right?
Well, unfortunately, Florida and Michigan aren't much different when you look at pure
right?
pupil funding throughout the nation. They rank 40th below, depending on the year. There was a bit more weighted student formula or funding for students that are special needs, but that's about it in Florida. Florida is by far not the model when you look at per pupil funding.
What is the model, you think?
Well, I think you look at places like Massachusetts, where you adequately fund public education for the most part. You provide extra resources for students with special needs. You're looking deeper for poverty, and you treat low-performing schools with extra support, not with penalties and sanctions in order to move the closure.
Yeah.
We're all parents up here on the stage. We've got a lot of parents in here. I know when I go into a classroom with my kids, I want to make sure that there's a teacher in front of the classroom. They've got the textbooks that they're going to be able to use, and that there's not an overwhelming number of kids that are actually in that classroom. Talk to us specifically right now what teacher vacancy number that you're looking at in terms of leveling classroom size where you're at right now.
Right, so right now we have 194 vacancies as of today. Last year, the district started with 276 vacancies. This year, we started with 250, plus adding 11 EAA schools, which were about 250 extra teachers. So apples to apples, we've actually improved. Over the summer, in only a month, we hired over 200 teachers. So we know we can recruit and retain teachers in Detroit. We just have to have a proactive strategy to do that. Last year, from January to the end of the year, the district only hired 30 teachers. That was last year. So this year, we're much ahead of that. We're leveling right now based on actual enrollment. Enrollment, as I said, is trending a bit higher than last year, so we're in a positive direction. Leveling means that schools that have an increase in enrollment will see an additional allocation. Those that decline will see fewer. And then we're going to look at class size. And that's something that we have to address within our budget. But it's really not necessarily a fiscal issue right now. It's a teacher recruitment issue, meaning we can add teachers to the budget, but if we don't have teachers to fill those positions, they just remain empty. Or vacant. We're not including long-term subs as full-time teachers, and we've only hired fully certified teachers. We're not lowering the bar in that area at all. We're still hiring fully certified teachers. I believe that this time next year we'll have a different conversation about vacancies. I think this summer proves we can recruit teachers. We just have to have a longer runway in order to recruit in advance and not scurry with only a couple of weeks, months before the school year started.